at the NATO summit meeting, and these lead lines from the New York Times best sum up what's gone down so far. President Trump has always relished throwing European leaders off balance, antagonizing allies, embracing insurgents, and setting off a frantic contest for how best to deal with him. Now, as Europe undergoes dizzying political changes of its own, it is throwing Mr. Trump off balance. For a president who prides himself on being the great disruptor, it was a startling turnabout, one that underscored how Europe's shifting landscape has scrambled the calculus for Mr. Trump. Which brings us to this moment from yesterday, where French President Macron, British Prime Minister Johnson, and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau were caught in a seemingly hot mic moment. NBC News has not confirmed who the world leaders were discussing. Representatives for both Johnson and Macron issued no comments when asked about the video in question. But we can do some math. President Trump's remarks alongside NATO's Secretary Stoltenberg were slated for 20 minutes as the first event of the day. According to the official White House transcript, the meeting ran approximately 53 minutes. Likewise, President Trump's midday meeting with French President Macron lasted around 38 minutes. They were making fun of him.
Yeah, I mean, if you're driving in the car, you couldn't hear that audio, but you had Prime Minister Trudeau saying his team's jaw dropped to the floor. He took 40 minutes.
We haven't corroborated that, but it's pretty clear when you watch it. It is obvious they're talking about him, they're mocking him, and they have very little respect for him at all, if any.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson in there and President Macron as well. Let's bring in Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker. Peter, about an hour from now, we'll see another meeting between President Trump and a world leader when he sits down with Chancellor Angela Merkel. Usually, as you know well, those pool sprays last a couple of minutes. They might answer a shouted question. Yesterday, they were ranging from about 40 minutes to 55 minutes.
Well, that's one thing about President Trump is you cannot predict him, you cannot schedule him, you cannot rein him in when it comes to these kinds of events. That when he gets going at one of these pool sprays, he can go on for 40 minutes because he just he enjoys the back and forth, he enjoys the give and take, and he wants to control the message. But as my colleague Mark Landler wrote this morning, it's an odd turnabout where it's the Europeans who in some ways are kind of keeping him off balance these days. President Macron of France yesterday, was sort of the aggressor in some ways. President Trump found himself actually defending NATO against President Macron's criticism. That's a pretty odd reversal of roles. And I think that, it shows that they're kind of 3 years in to the Trump presidency, sort of getting used to him and taking, moving on without trying to let him dominate and change everything to suit his own needs. He's a presence. They have to deal with him the way he is, but they're not going to allow him to be the only player on the stage.
Peter, having covered this president nearly every day throughout his term, have we bumped into a seminal moment in his presidency overseas when President Macron turns eyeball to Donald Trump and says, let's be serious? No one's ever done that to this president before, and he is non-confrontational, loves to bully people in the background and outside of a circle, not eyeball to eyeball, but let's be serious. What do you think is going to be the ramifications of that?
Yeah, I think it showed you how much things have changed because, of course, President Macron's initial strategy in dealing with President Trump was one of with flattery, one of, warmth and wrapping himself around the president. You remember that visit in Washington a couple of years back now, I guess, in which they were literally holding hands. It couldn't have been, President Trump reaches over and brushes the dust off of President Macron's jacket. The body language yesterday, very different. These are two men who are not in the same place. And President Macron has decided that strategy didn't work. He's going to have to deal with President Trump, and he's still trying to find ways of bridging the divide. He was trying as recently as August in France during the G7 to bring President Trump together with Iran. But I think he's made clear he's not going to lie down for President Trump either. He's trying to be the leader of Europe in some ways. Angela Merkel is in the twilight stage of her chancellorship. Boris Johnson is consumed with getting England and getting Britain out of Europe. So President Macron is sort of the main man on the stage right now.
Peter, I'm curious, is there any back talk there about the floater that Trump has done about pulling Putin into some of these organizations, and that Putin and Russia need to be part of this? Is that actually being discussed offline at NATO this year?
Well, I think it's being discussed because the president is hard to, ignore altogether. As president of the United States, any president of the United States brings up issues like that, then they have to be put on the table. But there's no real appetite for bringing Russia back into the G7 or bringing Russia into these international organizations right now. It's 5 years since their incursion, their invasion of eastern Ukraine, their seizure of Crimea and annexation of territory. Remember, this is the first time that the borders of Europe have changed since World War II via force, and most Europeans are very nervous about doing anything that seems to reward that. There's been no movement by President Putin in the last year or two or three to actually, change that situation or make up for it or find some way to resolve that conflict. And so simply allowing him back in, according to the Europeans, would be to embolden him and embolden others who would say that, yeah, this didn't actually cost him anything. He's able to use troops, use force, without any ramification.